never worked for Russia. It's a whole big fat hoax.
Russia could not have asked for a friendlier United States president.
They are a
no
joke.
way, no interview.
They're a joke over my dead body.
I am beginning to feel as though I am on the set of The Manchurian Candidate.
Make no mistake, this shutdown is caused by President Trump.
So here we are, because the Speaker of the House has decided that enforcing our own laws is now immoral.
It's no longer a political issue now, it's a human issue.
This is New Day with Alison Camerata and John Berman.
I want to welcome our viewers in the United States and around the world. This is New Day. It is Tuesday, January 15th, 6 o'clock here in New York. Day 25 of the government shutdown, and the Mueller investigation is set to take center stage again. It is expected to dominate the confirmation hearing for President Trump's Attorney General nominee, William Barr. In a few hours, Barr goes before the Senate Judiciary Committee. Democrats will press Barr on his past criticism of the Mueller probe. Barr is expected to say that Mueller should be allowed to finish his investigation and that the report should be made public, even though he has been quite critical of that in the past. So you'll remember that unsolicited memo that Barr sent to the Justice Department last year claiming that a president cannot obstruct justice. We now know who Barr shared that letter with, and we will tell you about that.
So what's historic here is that a president is under investigation, and today the Senate will question the person who will oversee that investigation. In just the last 24 hours, that investigation led the president to proclaim, "I never worked for Russia." In just the last 12 hours, CNN has learned that the president's team rejected a new request by the special counsel to question the president in person as part of this investigation, with a source telling us Mueller is not satisfied. We have a lot to discuss this morning. Joining us now, Garrett Graff, the author of The Threat Matrix Inside Robert Mueller's FBI and the War on Global Terror, former New Jersey Attorney General Ann Milgram, and former FBI Supervisory Special Agent Josh Campbell. Garrett, I want to start with you here, big picture. A president who says he never worked for Russia, under investigation for working with Russia. We have the man who will oversee that investigation, who we now know shared legal theory with the president's own defense team, nominated for Attorney General, facing questions from the Senate today. Not your average Tuesday.
It is not your average Tuesday. I mean, this is, as you started off the segment by saying, a historic day on many, many different levels. I'm unaware in the entire FBI's 100-year history of it ever opening a counterintelligence investigation on the president himself. Certainly, we've had FBIs investigating the president before for criminal violations. We saw that during Watergate. We saw that during Iran-Contra. We saw that during the Clinton years. But the idea that the FBI, which is charged with keeping foreign influence out of the United States, is so worried about our commander-in-chief that they fear that he is acting under orders, witting or unwitting, from a foreign power, our chief traditional adversary, is truly a stunning and historic moment.
And another historic moment, we've never seen the President of the United States have to deny and to reporters that he is somehow working for Russia, but that happened yesterday. So in case people missed it, here was this moment.
I never worked for Russia, and you know that answer better than anybody. I never worked for Russia. Not only did I never work for Russia, I think it's a disgrace that you even asked that question.
I mean, I'm not sure what people did want out of that question. And of course, what's he going to say? Of course, he's never going to say yes. And furthermore, as we know from all of the surrounding information and evidence and reporting, it's possible that Putin so expertly played some members of the Trump team, including his family, that they didn't know they were doing Russia's bidding.
Right. Well, even the fact that we're having this conversation is a stunning thing about the president of the United States being potentially an agent or working for Russia. So I think that alone is worth noting. The second piece about it is that this has been the conversation, is this question about why did the president do all this? Why does he continue to have these meetings with Putin? What's the motivation here? And I think this sort of line of inquiry from the New York Times really gets at the heart of what was going on. Why would the president be making these decisions, which are really hard to understand?
And that's the backdrop for today in Washington, Josh Campbell, where William Barr, former Attorney General, who will likely be the next Attorney General, faces questions from the Senate if he should be overseeing the Mueller investigation. And CNN learned within the last 24 hours. We know he shared this memo with Rod Rosenstein about why he didn't think the president should be investigated for obstruction of justice. But we also learned that he shared that memo with the president's own legal team and even had conversations with Jay Sekulow and the Raskins, who are doing the president's defense here. A discussion of defense strategy by the man who wants to oversee the investigation.
Yeah, the more and more we learn on this, we're headed toward the direction of recusal if he does the right thing. Now, when the memo first came out, there were a lot of people who looked at that with raised eyebrows, like, what is this? I remember we were sitting here talking about it, right? Going through it. Is this a job application, part of an interview he's trying to tee up here? But again, now we see there were additional conversations. This was more, getting in the weeds on the strategy. We have to move toward recusal because at the end of the day, the American people have to have confidence that he will oversee a Justice Department that will not be conflicted. You have to keep in mind that when someone recuses, that doesn't mean that you've done something wrong. It just means that there is either a real or perceived conflict, and you respect the American people so much that you want them to have confidence in the Justice Department, so you're willing to step aside and let someone else manage it. It's not saying he did something wrong, but if he does what's right, he would step aside and let someone else manage the investigation.
But Garrett, don't we now know the answer to what Josh was saying? What is this, a job interview, an audition? Yes. Now that we know that he sent it to Emmett Flood and Pat Cipollone and Jay Sekulow and Noel Francisco and all of the team of Donald Trump's lawyers, yes, that was a job. That was a job audition.
It was, but I don't necessarily, I first agree with Josh that it seems like under Justice Department ethics rules he would likely recuse. But remember, Rod Rosenstein's reaction to this memo publicly is, Bill Barr didn't have all the facts. We do. One of the things that we can expect Barr, if he steps in as Attorney General and if he steps in to oversee this investigation, is he will be read into it. He will know what Bob Mueller knows, as sort of where Bob Mueller is heading, what evidence he's collected, what the targets of the investigation are, what the timeline of the investigation is. And there's plenty of reasons to believe that Mueller is very far down the road of this probe as well. And potentially bringing large parts of it, or at least major new parts of it, to a conclusion in the next couple of weeks. So I think there's plenty of reason to believe that Mueller's probe could still make it to its natural conclusion, even if Barr steps in.
Look, sorry, go ahead, John.
No, I was just going to say that I don't disagree entirely there. The only thing that I'm saying is that at the end of the day, especially in these hypersensitive, polarized times, the American people have to have confidence that the Justice Department is acting fairly. And this isn't to say that Mr. Barr would act, in an inappropriate way. But again, with so much malfeasance that we've seen across the board, at the end of the day, the American people have to have confidence. And whether he gets read in and then learns more and then changes his mind, okay, that's fine. But if he remains in the same position, the public will left, wondering, did he come in with this intent?
But isn't part of the problem here that he wrote a 19-page memo about something he knows nothing about?
Yes.
Right? And we should go back to this point. He's a former attorney general. He's handled criminal investigations. Everyone who's done that at that level, I've done it, Josh has done it, you know that what you read publicly is not the truth of the investigation. So he knows that. He writes a 19-page memo assuming facts and law that I'm positive we all don't know. And so that to me is stunning, and that to me also shows that he's made a decision about the merits of this investigation with virtually no inside facts. I'm deeply troubled by that. So for the idea of him to not potentially recuse is stunning to me, given this.
This is the most curious thing of all, which is he wrote a memo about Mueller's theory of the investigation.
Without knowing the theory.
Exactly.
And without knowing the facts. And so this should be a huge focus of the conversation today is how do you do that unless it is a job interview, unless it's really a play to be part of this team?
And that's what he will be facing today when he faces the Senate, these questions. Again, I think it is likely he will get confirmed. He has tried to mitigate this by saying he wants to see the Mueller investigation continue and indicating, although with a major hedge, which I'll get to in a second, that he wants the Mueller report to come out. This is P209. My goal will be to provide as much transparency as I can, consistent with the law. I can assure you that where judgments are to be made by me, I will make those judgments based solely on the law and will let no personal, political, or other improper interests influence my decision. Garrett, that sounds great. However, we know that Barr's interpretation of the law, he believes wide latitude for executive privilege and authority.
Yes, and in fact is historically, if not outside the norm, certainly on the leading edge of the theories of executive power. And certainly that's one of the places where we can imagine that the Senate, as it provides its advise and consent, and an important check and balance on the power of the executive branch, will be weighing that in their conversations today.
And not only does it appear to have been a job application for Bill Barr, sending it specifically to the Trump team, saying, see, look at what I could offer. Here's my take. And it worked. I mean, by the way, that's why, perhaps that's why he was chosen. And we know that the president cares so much about loyalty. Yes. And so here it is, spelled out. We'll also perhaps see job auditions today from the panel who will be interviewing him. There are many people who are running for president, the Democrats who will be questioning him. So there'll be Cory Booker, Kamala Harris, Amy Klobuchar. So hopefully we will get real questions and not just, pontificating. But all of that will be on display.
I'm going to take the under on that, by the way.
I would take the under on that, too. I mean, look, we always think we're going to get great questions, and this should be a very fiery confirmation hearing. There's tons of things to question Barr about, not just the memo, also his ethics recusal, whether or not he'll abide by the guidance that he's given by Department of Justice officials. There's a lot here. But what I expect we'll see is, I don't expect that we'll see great questioning. And part of it is my experience working in the United States Senate is that, to be an effective questioner, you have to ask the second, the third, and the fourth question. And I think when you watch, you'll see a lot of people are not, you have to listen to the answers and go back and forth. And I always wish for it to happen, and I'm always a little surprised it doesn't.
What's interesting, too, is that, Democrats don't need advice from me on politics, but from the cheap seats here, as American people watch the last 2 years and how the rule of law has basically essentially been under assault, interesting to note that, moving ahead, this might be the law and order election where the rule of law is front of mind, where you have lots of issues. But at the end of the day, the American people want to know, are we going to have someone in office who respects our institutions of justice? And this might be that audition. Imagine you're going to have the whole world watching this hearing. So it'll be interesting to see what kind of sound bites they try to get out of this.
All right, 2 more things I want to discuss quickly if we can find the time. Number 1, CNN's reporting on Mueller wanting to question the president again. And number 2, this weird timeline with the president confiscating the notes from inside the meeting. Garrett, to you, we learned that Robert Mueller's team went back to the president's team and said, we want to talk to him in person. Mueller is not satisfied with his written response alone. Now, we know the president wasn't going to say yes to this. Mueller's thinking, what's the special prosecutor doing here?
Well, I think the honest answer is he's probably trying as hard as he can to get in front of the president. So much of obstruction of justice turns on this idea of sort of corrupt intent. What was the president thinking at the precise moment he was taking these various actions? The president is obviously within his legal right to fire Jim Comey, but if he is doing that with the intent to obstruct justice, that makes it an illegal act nonetheless. Mueller is a dogged prosecutor. He's thorough. And you can imagine that he wants to, as best he can, sit down and look across the table at Donald Trump and hear what he has to say.
Should we save the timeline?
I don't know. The timeline's really good.
All right. Do we have time, Megan? All right. Here's the timeline. This is what, as you know, there's all sorts of questions about why the president had these one-on-one meetings with Vladimir Putin and wouldn't share, even with his own advisors, top Russia experts, what was said, and confiscated the one interpreter who was in there, confiscated her notes and swore her to secrecy. So now here's an interesting timeline. This went down on July 7th, 2017. That morning, the New York Times asked the White House for a statement on the Trump Tower meeting, you'll remember, with Don Jr. At 3:45 p.m., Donald Trump and Vladimir Putin hold their first in-person meeting, and Trump takes the interpreter's notes and insists that the interpreter keep details of the conversation secret. Then that evening, President Trump and Vladimir Putin speak again, except for Putin's interpreter. And then Donald Trump says we talked about adoptions. On July 8th, aboard Air Force One, as you know, President Trump dictates that misleading Trump Tower statement, citing that it was about adoptions. Days later, it comes out that the Russian lawyer had actually promised dirt on Hillary Clinton. Why is all this suspicious, Josh?
Well, any one of these incidents that happened, alone in a vacuum, one would look at that and say, okay, well, that's, maybe not an issue there. The president wants to have a private conversation with another foreign leader and he doesn't want it to leak. But looking at the totality of the circumstances here, where you have, a pattern of the president and these questionable interactions with Russia. We know that he doesn't criticize Putin. We know about the past. We know about the lies. You mentioned the Trump Tower meeting there, which they had to, walk back, even, with a special counsel. And so the reason why it's troubling is because it continues to lead toward that one conclusion, which we don't know what it is yet. We can't completely draw a line. But why is the president unable to criticize Vladimir Putin? And you think about this, we saw over in Helsinki, the reports about him taking the notes. I mean, it's just stunning to think that the President of the United States wouldn't share the details of that conversation with others in his own government, if only to inform the national security apparatus about, what Russia's thinking is. But again, it's a pattern, it's troubling, and I don't think we've seen the end of it.
All right.
Thank you all very much. It'll be very interesting to see what happens today. So as the government shutdown reaches day 25, the White House may have a new strategy for trying to get support for the president's border wall. So we'll look at that next.
New Day, brought to you by great tasting nutrition.
All right, so the White House is planning to invite a group of moderate House Democrats to meet with President Trump today to discuss the government shutdown and the funding for his border wall. They are targeting leaders from districts the president won in 2016, hoping they might be able to peel away some support from Speaker Nancy Pelosi. Joining us now to talk about all of this, we have Bloomberg News senior White House correspondent Margaret Talev. We have Bloomberg News White House reporter Tolu Olorunipa and CNN senior political analyst John Avlon. Okay, Margaret, is this going to work today? Trying a new tack, meeting with moderate House Democrats?
Allison, I don't know if it's going to work, but it's better than doing nothing, I think, is the White House's plan right now. Look, the president has been trying for some time to shift the dynamic so that the American public, so that voters begin to see the shutdown as a Democratic-created problem. That's part of what the president's trying to do here, is really not about changing those Democratic votes. It is about changing the way Americans perceive it. But he also has been hopeful that there are some Democrats in some districts who will feel enough of the heat for the Democrats to force some kind of an offer, an initial negotiating offer, that they will somehow turn on Nancy Pelosi and try to press for that. I think it's unclear whether that will work. There's no sign right now that that will work, but the president has to do something, and he has foreclosed the most recent sort of suggestion by Senator Lindsey Graham to take a little pause, resume funding for a while, and then return to the wall debate. So this is the obvious natural next step.
Yeah, look, I mean, he's the one who said he would own the shutdown. He is the one who rejected the latest compromise offer from Republicans here. And he's looking at this polling, which says that 55% of Americans blame Donald Trump for the shutdown, that 56% of Americans oppose a border wall here, John. And so I'm not sure the public opinion is moving. The Quinnipiac pulled out a fascinating stat yesterday, which is that only 2% of people said that they had their minds changed from the president's Oval Office address. Opinions are set here.
Yeah, and that's because he set the table himself in that first meeting by ending the shutdown. It's a little late for the president to find religion on swing voters in swing states and swing districts. And these moderates are going to come in there and they will say exactly what we yesterday on CNN had one of these members of Congress who comes from a swing district who's been targeted by the White House said, look, end the shutdown first. Then let's deal. And any deal is going to be a balanced deal along the lines of which Lindsey Graham and others have proposed, and the president's rejected to date. That's the only off-ramp here. And the optics fight, guess what, folks? It's lost. We're done here on that front.
Tolu, let's move on and talk about racism. Apparently, everything has a shelf life, including racist comments. And yesterday, Iowa Congressman Steve King hit his expiration date. Why do you think that suddenly, when he gave that interview last week or whenever it was to the New York Times and said, what's the problem with white supremacy or something to that effect, I'm paraphrasing, he has said a host of racist things. Why yesterday did he seem to run out of runway?
Yeah, I think the comments from Representative King were just so egregious that Republicans had no choice. They were going to be asked about this on Sunday shows. You had already seen Senator Tim Scott of South Carolina come out and forcefully say that that's the reason that Republicans are accused of racism, because they sort of go into their hiding places whenever they're asked about comments like this. So there was a lot of pressure on leading Republicans to take action and to show that they weren't just going to sweep this under the rug and allow Steve King to continue making these types of comments. He has a long history of going right up to the edge and often going over the edge. And obviously these most recent comments were much beyond what can be seen as acceptable in political discourse. And the Republicans felt that they needed to take action. So stripping him of his committee assignments was the major step. And now there is a push to potentially censure him in the Congress. So this was a first step, and it could be a sign of even bigger things to come in the future for Steve King.
John, why are these racist comments from Steve King different from the other racist comments from Steve King? I suppose we could play some. Let's just play a couple of the greatest hits from Steve King here.
For everyone who's a valedictorian, there's another 100 out there that they weigh 130 pounds and they've got calves the size of cantaloupes because they're hauling 75 pounds of marijuana across the desert.
We have growing elements in America that want to destroy Western civilization. This argument that diversity is our strength, I just wonder if anybody ever questions that.
Yeah, and, he said in that New York Times article, he looked over the Democratic side and it looked like no country for white men.
Yeah, and these are just little tastes. I mean, this goes back to Steve King refusing to acknowledge or apologize for slave labor building the Capitol. Steve King saying that if Barack Obama won the election, that Islamic terrorists would be dancing in the streets. I mean, this is nothing that should have snuck up on anybody. What happened is the statement was so in your face. When did white supremacy become something we couldn't talk about and defend? And then Tim Scott, senator from South Carolina, wrote an op-ed because there was a period in which Republicans were hoping this would go away, that maybe they could divert attention by focusing on the new incoming class of Democrats away from Steve King. Now they've confronted it. Good first step. But the problem is not just Steve King. It's a deeper problem the party has to reconcile with if they want to reclaim the legacy of Lincoln.
Well, Margaret, a lot of people talk about that is Steve King a proxy somehow for President Trump? That, Steve King says things that Donald Trump has said in terms of both sides being equal. There are good people on both sides in Charlottesville, but somehow Steve King just, again, yesterday, that seemed to be the tipping point. And now, he's lost some of his committee positions.
All of them.
And, all of them. And so what will happen to him? Does he stay in Congress?
Yeah, I mean, I think one thing to look at is to what extent he'll get financing, or party support for any bid for re-election. And you are seeing some lawmakers now, like we've seen Mitt Romney come out and just flat out say, he should resign. There's a couple of things that he said that caught my attention. One is President Trump. You're right. President Trump was asked about this yesterday, and at least yesterday basically brushed off the question saying, I haven't really been paying attention to that. So I think there'll be some continued pressure on him to speak more forcefully about this. But the other is that racism is notoriously, or racial tension, racial, this broad range of issues is very hard to pull. But since Charlottesville, we know a couple of things, which is, one is that Democrats overwhelmingly believe the Republican Party has a race problem. And two is that overwhelmingly Americans from both parties and who are independents as well say that that white supremacy and white nationalism are not appropriate positions to hold in today's society. So I think there are some pressures since the November elections on the Republican Party to clarify what the what the overarching mission of the party is and what the beliefs of the party are, and we're seeing some of that today.
I will note it's unusual the president didn't know about the Steve King story. We knew an awful lot about Jeff Bezos in the Washington Post. He knows an awful lot about other stuff.
Funny that.
Yeah,
he is a consumer of cable news.
I think he
don't know if it was the cable out in the White House?
Flavor wasn't covering the controversy.
He watches us, though. We've been covering it. He knows about Steve King.
Yeah.
But he also knows about fast food.
But he was too busy chowing down on fast food.
He knows a lot about fast food, and he loves fast food. And so he invited in, Clemson?
Clemson.
Thank you. That part, I can tell you about the food all day long, people. And he had this delicious buffet spread out.
And that delicious photograph. First of all, the interior overcoat always blows my mind.
It's cold. It's cold.
It's cold in there because they're shut down. They've turned down the heat, too. But what you can't see is the portrait of Lincoln overseeing the fast food spread being like, what's going on here now? What you doing in my living room? It's amazing.
Okay, so here's what President Trump said to the team about what they would be eating.
So I had a choice. Do we have no food for you because we have a shutdown? Or do we give you some little quick salads that the First Lady will make along with the Second Lady? They'll make some salads. And I said, you guys aren't into salads.
Margaret, how awesome is that trip back to 1950? In President Trump's world, it's always the 1950s where the little ladies will go and make you some salads because that's what women eat. And you men I'll order in McDonald's for the rest of us.
Diet heart disease, yeah.
I heard they had like a pile of takeout salads over to the side, which also came. You know, I was actually so inspired that I hit Shake Shack last night on my way home. So I'm not going to begrudge him this. I think part of it is that he likes fast food. It was a good excuse to get some. But he does have a really high-end restaurant at his hotel like a mile away. So I think if he wanted to splurge for like Caesar salads or, steak or chicken or something, that also could have been an option. He could have paid for it himself, or I guess he could have. Maybe he couldn't have. Maybe there was some emoluments reason why. I don't know. But in any case, the president loves fast food, and he thought the guys would really like it, and that he could make a point about furloughs. It was interesting messaging.
So, Lou, heck of a picture there, huh?
Yeah, that was quite a picture. And when you hear the president say, make America great again, you sort of think that he's thinking about the time in the 1950s and the 1960s where you had, hamburgers and football players and the women in the kitchen making salad. And this is what President Trump sees as sort of the great era of American history. And he's sort of trying to harken back to that with, even with his overcoat, with Lincoln looking over his shoulder. President Trump is trying to send the message that he's making America great again with McDonald's in the White House.
One burger at a time.
One burger at a time.
All right, Lou, John, Margaret, thank you very much. We are learning chilling new details in the kidnapping of Jamie Kloss, how the suspect allegedly carried it out, and her 88 days of horror in captivity. That's next. It is Judgment Day for British Prime Minister Theresa May's Brexit deal. She faces the prospect of a crushing defeat and a possible no-confidence vote if her plan fails. CNN's Bianca Novolo live outside Parliament with the very latest. Bianca.
As you say, John, it is decision day for Brexit, the biggest political crisis to face the UK since World War II. It's divided the country as much as it's divided the politicians. From the protesters you might be able to see behind me, it's reverberated to every corner of the UK. And it's split the ruling Conservative Party apart, that's lost 3 prime ministers over the issue of Europe and could yet lose a 4th in Theresa May. And that's because today Parliament votes on the Prime Minister's unpopular Brexit deal. So she's asked lawmakers to think about how history will remember them.
People will look at the decision of this House tomorrow and ask, did we deliver on the country's vote to leave the European Union? Did we safeguard our economy, our security and our union? Or did we let the British people down?
The Prime Minister has warned lawmakers that if they don't back her compromise deal, they could risk a chaotic, crash-out Brexit or even no Brexit at all. And it's quite startling to think that it's about 3 years since the initial referendum and almost 2 months until Brexit, and we still don't know what shape Brexit will take or if there'll even be a Brexit at all. Alison.
Bianca, thank you very much. The soundtrack behind you also makes it very dramatic. Thank you for that report. So here at home, President Trump's inaugural committee is facing new scrutiny. A report in the New York Times details how they spent nearly $100 million on the inauguration. That is twice as much or more than Barack Obama and George W. Bush raised for their inaugurations. According to the New York Times, spending by the Trump Inaugural Committee included $10,000 for makeup, another $30,000 in per diem payments to dozens of contract workers, in addition to their fully covered hotel rooms, room service orders, plane tickets, taxi rides, even some laundry drop-off. The report also says $1 million was spent at the president's hotel in Washington. Disclosure of these spending details comes as federal prosecutors are investigating the Trump inaugural committee over the donations that funded all of this.
Yeah, Greg Jenkins, who ran George W. Bush's second inaugural, told me he can't figure this out because Trump had a smaller staff running his inauguration and fewer events and spent twice as much money.
How do you get to $100 million?
Very carefully.
Very quickly.
Practice,
apparently.
practice,
Yeah,
practice.
exactly. That's right.
All right, the suspect in the Jamie Kloss kidnapping case told investigators he tried to abduct the 13-year-old girl twice before actually going through with his plan. According to a criminal complaint, Jake Patterson first noticed Jamie boarding a school bus and did not know her name until he murdered her parents and took her captive for 88 days. Jamie escaped last week. She tells investigators Patterson shot her mother right in front of her as they tried to hide from him in a bathtub. Kloss says she was forced to stay under the suspect's bed, and he threatened her during much of her time in captivity. Officials have now released a 911 call from the neighbors who took Jamie in after she managed to escape.
Douglas County 911.
Hi. I have a young lady at my house right now, and she just says her name is Jamie Kloss.
Okay, have you seen her photo, ma'am?
Yes, it is her. I 100% think it is her.
Are you, okay.
100%. So we're kind of scared because he might come.
Yep.
So if the cops could get here soon, we would love
I have many deputies headed that way. I'm going to keep you on the line.
Okay.
And she said, I am Jamie Kloss.
Yes. She said, he killed my parents. I want to go home. Help me.
Oh, the calm of that dispatch officer, so impressive.
And the neighbor.
Completely. I had a chance to talk to the neighbor. She was incredibly poised through this whole thing. Patterson is charged with intentional homicide, kidnapping, and armed burglary. His bail set at $5 million.
Well, obviously, this is just hideous on every single level. And it is so rare, you know, for stranger abduction. Okay, that's thankfully extremely rare. But this is one of these cases where he saw her, he didn't know her. I mean, according to the court documents, he targeted her and in the most heinous way got rid of any of the obstacles for getting her.
Incredibly heinous. And again, you've covered so many of these, and you point out almost always there's some kind of connection.
Always there's a connection. Often it's family.
Yep.
But in this one, much like Elizabeth Smart, there wasn't. So we will have an FBI profiler coming up to tell us about what it takes for that suspect to be able to do what he did. Also, there's a new report that says White House aides are becoming increasingly concerned that President Trump will pull out of NATO. That also happens to be Vladimir Putin's #1 goal.